It is a little before noon on a spring day in the year 1531, and the open field at Smithfield, just outside the northwest wall of London, smells of wood smoke and wet livestock. This is a cattle market. On most mornings the ground here is churned by hooves and hemmed with pens, and men haggle over the price of an ox. But today the pens have been pushed back, and in the cleared space stands a great iron vessel, the kind you might use to render fat or brew ale for a whole household, only larger, set on a bed of stone with a fire already breathing underneath it. A chain hangs from a wooden arm above the vessel, the arm of a gibbet, the same simple machine of beam and pulley that a builder would use to lift stone. A man is led into the field with his hands bound. He is a cook. His name is Richard Roose, and he already knows what the vessel is for, because the sentence was read to him in words no Englishman had ever heard passed on a prisoner before. He is not going to be hanged. He is not going to be burned. He is going to be put into the water in that pot and lifted out and put in again for as long as it takes. The crowd has come out in numbers, the way a crowd always does when the state has invented something new, and the water in the great pot is just beginning to move. Hold there for a moment, with the fire lit and the water starting to stir, because everything about this scene is stranger than it looks. What is about to happen to Richard Roose is not some ancient custom crawling out of the Dark Ages. It is brand new. Boiling a human being to death was not, in 1531, a punishment that English law recognized at all, and it would not be one for very long. But here is what most people do not know. The method you are watching was written into law for a single man, by name, for a crime he had already committed, by a king who stood up in his own parliament to demand it. It was aimed at one kind of criminal for one kind of reason. It claimed only a handful of lives in total, and it was gone inside a single generation. Almost everything the modern imagination believes about death by boiling, that it was common, that it was medieval, that they boiled people in oil, that it was hours of screaming agony by design, is either wrong or badly out of focus. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how this punishment worked, on the body and on the page, why a government reached for something this theatrical, and where the record goes quiet and the legend takes over. We are a channel about the machinery of death, the real devices and the real laws, how they were built, how they worked, and how much of what you have been told is true. If that is the kind of history you want told plainly and without flinching, take a second to subscribe and stay with this one, because the twist in it is not the pot. It is the paper. Now let me take you back into the world that made this possible. The England of 1531 is a nervous, watchful place. Henry VIII has sat on the throne for more than 20 years, and he is in the middle of the great crisis of his reign, the long fight to shed his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and marry Anne Boleyn, a fight that is dragging the whole kingdom toward a break with Rome. Loyalties are splitting. Men who were friends are becoming enemies over a question of marriage and church. And into this tense season falls a crime that touches one of the most dangerous nerves in the early modern mind: the fear of poison. To understand why the king reacted the way he did, you have to understand what poison meant to people in this century. A man could arm himself against a robber. A lord could keep guards against an assassin with a knife. Rank and strength and vigilance were defenses against almost everything except this. Poison defeated all of them. It came at the table, from the hand of a servant or a cook or a trusted friend, in the one moment when a person was least on guard, when he was simply eating. The jurist, John Bridle, would later write that to kill by poison was the most detestable of all killings, because it was the most horrible and most fearful to the nature of man. It was coded as cowardly and treacherous, a betrayal of the sacred trust between a host and his guest, a master and his servant. It was, in the language of the age, unnatural. And in February of 1531, that unnatural thing appeared to have happened in the household of a bishop. John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, was not just any churchman. He was the most stubborn and eloquent defender of Queen Catherine in all of England, the one man of real stature who would not bend on the king's divorce. On or about the 18th of February, in the kitchen of Fisher's residence at Lambeth, a white powder was mixed into the pottage. Pottage was the ordinary food of a great house, a thick boiled porridge of grains and vegetables, cooked in a common pot and ladled out to everyone, from the gentlemen of the household down to the poor who gathered at the gate for alms. That is what made this poisoning so wide and so cruel. It did not strike a single cup. It struck the common dish. Somewhere between 16 and 17 people fell violently ill. 2 of them died. One was a gentleman of the household named Bennet Kirwan. The other was a poor widow named Alice Trippitt, a woman who had come to a bishop's gate looking for charity, and was given, instead, her death. Bishop Fisher himself, the man many assumed was the target, happened not to eat the dish that day, and lived. It is worth pausing on who actually died, because it says everything about the reach of the crime. Bennet Kirwan belonged inside the household, one of the bishop's own gentlemen. Alice Trippitt did not. She was one of the poor of London, a widow who had come to the gate of a great churchman for the charity that such houses were expected to give, and was handed a bowl of the same pottage the family ate. The Tudor household understood the giving of alms as a Christian duty, and the beggars gathering at the gate for food were part of the ordinary daily life of a place like Fisher's. So the powder dropped into the common pot did not merely threaten a bishop and his gentlemen. It ran straight down the whole social order and killed a poor widow where she stood waiting for kindness. A crime that entered through the most intimate trust of the house. The hand that stirred the food reached out and struck the most defenseless person standing anywhere near it. The cook was a man named Richard Roose, though the records also spell it Rouse or Rose, or simply call him Cook. When he was taken, he did not deny putting the powder in the food. What he denied was intent. He said he had believed the powder to be nothing worse than a purgative, a laxative, and that the whole thing had been meant as a coarse kitchen prank on the household. Not as murder. We cannot know whether that was true. What we can say is that it did not save him, because by the time his case was decided, it was not being decided in an ordinary court at all. Henry VIII took the matter to Parliament, and he did not send it there quietly through his ministers. The king himself came before the Lords to press for action, lending the full weight of the crown to the demand for a new and terrible law. Consider the speed of the thing, because the speed is part of the horror. The poisoning came in the middle of February. Within a matter of weeks, a statute had been drafted, argued and passed. A named man had been condemned without a trial. An entirely new method of execution had been written into English law, and that man had been put to death in it. A poisoning in February, a corpse in the cauldron by spring. That is not the slow grinding of justice. That is a state moving at the speed of fear. And Parliament, at the King's urging, did something extraordinary. It passed an Act, 22 Henry VIII, Chapter 9, known as the Acte for poisoning. The Act declared that willful murder by poison would from now on be treated as high treason, the gravest category of crime in the realm. But it did not stop at defining a new crime. It reached backward and named Richard Roose inside the statute itself, condemned him by Act of Parliament without any trial by jury, and set out for him a punishment that English common law had never known. He was to be boiled to death. The statute's own words ordered that he be, and I am quoting the spelling of the age, boiled to death without having any advantage of his clergy. That last phrase is the whole legal machine in a single line, so let me open it up, because this is where the real device of this story lives. The advantage of clergy, benefit of clergy, was one of the strangest survivals in English law. A medieval privilege by which a person who could read, originally a member of the clergy but by Tudor times almost any literate man, could escape the ordinary punishment for many serious crimes by proving his literacy in court. It was a loophole in the machinery of death, and it saved a great many necks. By writing that Rose would be boiled without any advantage of his clergy, the statute deliberately slammed that door shut. There would be no reading his way out. And to feel how large that door was, you have to know how benefit of clergy actually worked in the room. A man who claimed it was handed a Bible in open court and asked to read aloud a verse of Latin scripture. And in practice it was almost always the same verse, the opening of the 51st Psalm, a plea to God for mercy. So many condemned men had saved their own lives by reciting it that the line earned a grim nickname. They called it the neck verse, the piece of Latin that kept your neck out of the noose. A first offender who could stumble through it was typically branded on the thumb with a hot iron, marked so that he could never claim the trick a second time, and spared the worst of his sentence. It was arbitrary. It plainly favoured the educated over the illiterate poor, and by the 16th century it had become one of the great escape hatches in all of English criminal law. The Act for Poisoning reached out and nailed that hatch shut for Richard Roose in a single deliberate clause. Whatever mercy the older law might still have held for him, the new law was written on purpose to deny it, and by categorizing his crime as treason rather than as ordinary murder, the statute reached for its most extreme register, the one reserved for those who struck at the order of the realm itself. Treason did not only carry the worst death, it carried forfeiture, the loss of a condemned man's lands and goods to the crown, and the taint of blood that could ruin a family after him. The law was not merely killing Rose, it was pronouncing him an enemy of the whole state. Think about what has actually been built here. Parliament has passed a law that applies to one named man for an act he committed weeks before the law existed, that invents a method of killing unknown to the country's legal tradition, and that closes off in advance the one mercy he might have claimed. This is not a court reaching a verdict. This is a legislature building an execution to order, retroactively, for a single person. The instrument that let Parliament do this has a name, the Act of Attainder, and it deserves a moment of its own, because it is one of the darker tools in the whole history of English government. An attainder was a legislative conviction. Instead of a court hearing evidence and a jury weighing it and returning a verdict, Parliament simply declared a named person guilty and pronounced the penalty, with all the force of law and none of the protections of a trial. There was no requirement to face your accusers, no jury of your neighbours, no defence in the ordinary sense. In the years around this case, Henry VIII would reach for the attainder again and again to destroy people he had decided to be rid of, and he would stretch the very definition of treason far past anything his predecessors had claimed. Until, before the decade was out, mere words, the denial of the king's titles, could send a man to a traitor's death. The boiling of Richard Roose belongs inside that larger project, a reign steadily gathering into the hands of the king and his parliament the power to name a crime, name the criminal, and name the death, all in one motion, all on one afternoon. That is why later generations of English lawyers looked back on this episode with such unease. The cauldron was a horror of a single day. The attainder was a horror of principle. The pot at Smithfield is terrible, but the truly novel machine in 1531 is the sheet of parchment that sends him there. Now let us turn to the other machine, the physical one, and look at exactly how death by boiling was carried out, because the mechanics matter, and most of what people picture is wrong. Start with the vessel. In the English cases, the medium was water, not oil, and not molten metal, whatever the legends say. The container was a large cauldron of iron or lead, big enough to hold a grown man, set over an open fire in the same way you would set any great cooking pot. There were, across the recorded history of this punishment, two fundamentally different ways to use it, and the difference is the difference between a quick death and a long one. In the first method, the liquid is brought to a rolling boil first, and the condemned is lowered into water that is already at its full heat. This is faster. The body's systems are overwhelmed quickly. In the second method, the prisoner is placed into cold or merely warm water, secured, and the fire is built up underneath him only afterward, so that the water heats slowly with the man already inside it. This is the crueler procedure, drawing the process out as the temperature climbs by degrees, so that the condemned feels the water pass through merely hot, to scalding, to unbearable, to killing over long minutes rather than in a single plunge. The choice between them was, in effect, a dial of severity that the authorities could turn, and the direction they turned, it announced how much they wanted the death to be seen and felt. Nothing about it required skill in the modern sense. There was no craftsman's art here of the kind a headsman needed, no single clean stroke to get right. The executioner's whole task was patience and staging, tending the fire, working the chain, deciding when to lower and when to raise. That is part of what makes this punishment so unsettling to study. Its horror was not hidden in some ingenious mechanism that took genius to build. It was assembled entirely out of the most ordinary equipment of daily life: a cooking pot, a fire, a length of chain, a builder's pulley, arranged with a cold and unhurried deliberateness. For Richard Roose, the record suggests something designed to be slow and visible in a third way. The Chronicle of the Grey Friars of London, a contemporary account, records that he was locked in a chain and pulled up and down with a gibbet at divers times till he was dead. Read that carefully, because it tells you the exact staging. He was fastened into chains, not simply dropped in and held down. Those chains ran up to the arm of a gibbet, a beam with a pulley, the ordinary lifting machine of any building site or dockside. And using that pulley, the executioner lowered him into the boiling water and then raised him back out of it, again and again, at various times, until he died. The gibbet turned the execution into something that could be paused and repeated. Immersion and withdrawal, immersion and withdrawal, each cycle prolonging what a single plunge would have ended. The machine here is almost mundane: a pot, a fire, a chain, a pulley. Its cruelty is not in any clever engineering. It is in the decision to use simple tools slowly. What does boiling water actually do to a human body? Let me describe it plainly, the way an anatomist would, because understanding the physiology is understanding the punishment. Water at or near boiling causes immediate and catastrophic scald, burns wherever it touches. The outer layer of skin is destroyed in seconds, and with continued exposure, the burning drives downward through the skin into the subcutaneous fat, and then into the muscle beneath, producing what a modern clinician would classify as third and fourth degree burns across large areas of the body at once. When burns cover that much surface, the body loses fluid catastrophically through the ruined skin, blood volume collapses, and the victim goes into what is called hypovolemic shock, a failure of circulation that the heart cannot sustain. There is a reason burns are measured by the percentage of the body they cover, and not simply by their depth. A relatively shallow scald across most of a person is far more lethal than a deep burn on one limb, because it is the sheer area of destroyed skin that empties the body of the fluid it needs to keep the blood moving. Full immersion in boiling water attacks nearly the entire surface at once, which is why it kills so surely. In the method used on Roose, the raising and lowering added a further, colder cruelty. Each time he was lifted from the water into the spring air, the exposed and ruined skin would have met a sudden shock of cold, and each time he was lowered again, the burning began afresh on tissue already destroyed. The repetition was not to keep him conscious, it was to keep the spectacle going, to make the dying last as a performance. Death comes, in the end, from that shock and from cardiac arrest. And here is a mercy hidden inside the horror, one the old chroniclers did not understand, but modern medicine does. A person subjected to this would not remain conscious and aware throughout the whole ordeal. The shock to the system, the collapse of blood pressure, the sheer overwhelming of the nervous system, these bring unconsciousness well before the body has finished dying. When the sources speak of an execution that lasted a long time, sometimes as much as 2 hours, They are describing the length of the spectacle, the time from first immersion to final stillness, not 2 hours of sustained, knowing agony. That distinction is not a comfort anyone in the crowd would have felt, but it is the truth of the body, and this is a channel that tells you the truth of the body. Why would a state design a death like this at all? Not for information, the way torture on the rack was meant to extract a confession. Boiling was not an interrogation. It was a message. Its whole purpose lived in that field full of people. A public execution in the 16th century was a piece of state theatre, an argument made in flesh about who held power and what happened to those who broke the deepest rules. And the punishment was chosen to answer the specific crime. Poison was the secret killing, the invisible betrayal that no one could see coming. So the law replied with the most visible death imaginable, the opposite of secrecy, a man cooked in the open before a market crowd. The hidden was answered with the exposed. The unnatural death at the dinner table was answered with an unnatural death in the public square. There is a grim logic to it, the same logic that, on the continent, would put counterfeiters into pots of boiling oil, so that the men who had melted and recast the coin of the realm were themselves melted. Punishment mirroring crime. The design goal was never efficiency. If the king had wanted Rose dead efficiently, the gallows stood ready. The design goal was meaning and terror and the sight of it. Let us go back to Smithfield then, and to the man in the chains, because the human reality is the proof of everything the mechanism promised. We do not have a diary from Richard Roose. We do not have his last words recorded in any reliable form. What we have is the shape of the day, assembled from the chronicles. And it is enough. The execution, by the traditional date, took place on the 5th of April, 1531. Though I want to be honest that the sources do not fully agree on the day, and some place it a year later. He was brought to the field, and the crowd was large because word of a new kind of death travels fast and draws people the way nothing else does. He was chained, he was hoisted, and according to a contemporary account, the sight was more than some could bear. The description that has come down to us says that he roared mighty loud, and that women in the crowd, who were great with child, felt sick at what they saw and were carried away half dead. I give you that scene the way it reaches us, as a report from the time rather than as a fact I can nail to a single manuscript, because the honest state of the record is that this vivid line is repeated everywhere and traceable cleanly to almost nowhere. But whether or not those exact women fainted on that exact day, the underlying truth is not in doubt. This was designed to be unwatchable, and it was watched, and it did to the crowd what it was built to do. Stand in that crowd for a moment yourself, through the eyes of someone who might plausibly have been there. Imagine a young kitchen servant from another great house across the river, sent out to Smithfield on purpose to see this, so that the lesson would travel home in a living witness. If such a person stood in that field, they would already have known the ground under their feet, because Smithfield was the city's great open-air stage for death, long before Richard Roose was ever born. It was here, in the year 1305, that the Scottish leader William Wallace had been hanged, drawn, and quartered before an enormous crowd. It was here that Lollard heretics had been burned in earlier reigns, and it was here that, only a generation after Roose, the fires of Queen Mary would consume Protestant men and women by the score in the 1550s. This was not a random patch of grass. It was a place the city understood, a field that meant one thing when the pens were pushed back and a fire was lit in the open, and our imagined servant, having watched a cook boiled in that field, would have carried the sight back across the river into a kitchen exactly like the one where the crime began, and would have looked at the great pottage pot steaming on the hearth, and at their own two hands with a fear that did not fade. That transfer of terror out of the public field and into the private kitchen was not a side effect of the punishment, it was the entire point of it. Now consider who these victims were, because it tells you what the punishment was really about. Richard Roose was a cook. The one other person we can name with confidence as having suffered this death in England was a maidservant named Margaret Davy, sometimes written Davy, who was boiled at this same Smithfield on the 17th of March, 1542, some 11 years after Roose. She had been condemned for poisoning, and by some accounts she had poisoned in more than one household, in as many as 3, killing those she served. Because she died in 1542, only 5 years before the whole punishment was abolished, Margaret Davy holds a quiet, terrible distinction. She is generally regarded as the last person ever boiled alive under English law. There are shadows of 1 or 2 other cases. A maidservant said to have been boiled at King's Lynn for poisoning her mistress, for instance. But the records are thin, and the 2 names that stand on solid ground across the entire life of this law are Richard Roose and Margaret Davy, a cook and a servant, both of them people who stood inside the trust of a home, who prepared or served the food, who were let close to the family at its most defenseless moment. That is the pattern. The punishment was aimed with special fury at the poisoner, precisely because the poisoner was the enemy within the walls, the hand you had to trust turned against you. If you had lived in a great house in these years, you would have understood the message in your stomach every time a servant set a dish in front of you. The boiling of Richard Roose was a law about murder, but it was felt as a law about the terrifying intimacy of the household, about the fact that the people who fed you were the people who could most easily kill you. And here is where I have to slow down and separate what is real from what has grown up around this punishment. Because death by boiling has become one of those subjects where the legend runs far ahead of the record, and untangling them is the whole point of doing history instead of just telling scary stories. Here is what the record actually says. Start with the belief that boiling was a common English punishment, some long-running feature of the brutal old days. It was not. It existed in English law for 16 years, from the Act of 1531 to its repeal in 1547. And in that entire window, the number of people we can actually document being boiled to death under it is tiny. A small handful, with Richard Roose and Margaret Davy as the only 2 names that stand on firm ground. This was not the routine machinery of Tudor justice. It was a brief, exceptional, panic-born experiment. Most people who imagine a medieval England regularly boiling its criminals are imagining something that never existed. Then there is the oil. Ask most people how someone was boiled alive, and they will tell you, boiled in oil, and they will picture a pot of shimmering, smoking oil. For the English cases, this is simply wrong. The medium was water. Oil does appear in the history of this punishment, but on the continent and in specific cases, a man boiled in oil at Nuremberg in 1392 for the rape and murder of his mother. Another at Bremen in 1687 for helping counterfeiters escape. Oil and molten lead belong more to the torture law and the legendary register than to the ordinary statutory death, because full immersion in oil or in molten metal, which sits at temperatures far above boiling water, would kill faster and more violently, not slower. The slow, drawn-out, repeated dipping that the sources actually describe is a water story. The molten lead of the popular imagination belongs in the same drawer of exaggeration. Lead does not melt until it reaches a temperature more than 3 times that of boiling water, and a body lowered into it would not linger at all. It would be destroyed almost at once. The very slowness that makes the boiling story so horrifying is possible only with water, and it is water that the English record describes. What has happened over the centuries is that boiling alive has become a kind of byword, a shorthand the imagination reaches for whenever it wants to picture the cruelty of the past, conjuring bubbling pots and screaming victims as a general feature of some savage older world. The reality is narrower, colder, and in its own way more disturbing than the cartoon. This was not the routine of a barbaric age. It was a specific instrument, reached for rarely, aimed at particular crimes, and defended every step of the way in the calm language of law. There is a related error I want to correct, because it shows how even careful people get this wrong. It is often said that the great imperial law code of the Holy Roman Empire, the Constitutio Criminalis Carolina of 1532, ordered counterfeiters to be boiled. It did not. The Carolina generally prescribed burning at the stake for serious counterfeiting. The boiling of coiners was real, but it was an older, local, customary practice in certain German and Hanseatic towns. Forgers boiled at Danzig in 1452, at Stralsund in 1471, and it existed alongside the Carolina's fire, rather than because the Carolina commanded it. The distinction matters because the truth is that boiling was never anywhere a broad, codified norm. Everywhere it appears, it is narrow, offence-specific, and local. An exceptional answer to a particular kind of crime, not a general tool of medieval justice. And what about the agony, the hours of conscious screaming that the word boiling calls up in the mind? Here the honest answer complicates the horror without softening the moral weight of it. The chronicle figure of around 2 hours, where it appears, describes the total duration of the event, the whole grim performance of chain and gibbet and repeated immersion. It does not describe 2 hours of a man fully awake and feeling everything. As I said, the physiology tells us that shock and the collapse of the body's systems would have taken consciousness relatively early. The spectacle was long by design. The suffering, as suffering, was almost certainly shorter than the legend insists. This is not an argument that it was humane. It is an argument that we should describe even the worst things accurately, because the accurate version is disturbing enough, and because a channel that inflates the record to be scarier has stopped doing history. And doing history honestly means admitting how much of even this famous case sits on uncertain ground. Look at how many of the vivid details carry a quiet question mark once you press on them. The exact day of the execution is genuinely disputed. The traditional date is the 5th of April, 1531, and that is the one I would put on the screen. But respectable sources place it a full year later, in 1532, and the honest thing is to say plainly that we are not certain. The famous duration, the roughly 2 hours, comes to us softly, more as tradition than as a firmly documented fact. The unforgettable image of pregnant women fainting in the crowd is repeated in book after book, and yet is very hard to trace to any single reliable manuscript. Even whether Rose was tortured on the rack before he died is only probable, not proven. What survives beyond real dispute is a smaller, harder core. The statute, in its own words, the 2 named dead at the bishop's gate, and the chronicle line about the chain and the gibbet. Everything else is reconstruction, more or less confident, and a documentary that respects you will tell you which is which. One more legend clings to this case, and it is the most seductive one, so let me be careful with it. Because Bishop Fisher was Queen Catherine's fiercest champion, and because his poisoning came at the very height of the King's War to be rid of Catherine and marry Anne Boleyn, whispers began almost immediately that the Boleyn faction was behind it, that someone close to Anne had paid or pushed the cook to strike at the bishop. The imperial ambassador, Eustace Chapuis, reported that suspicion was attaching to the lady and her father. It is a story with everything, a poisoning, a royal mistress, a doomed queen's defender, and it is exactly the kind of story to be skeptical of. As a rumour that genuinely circulated at the time, it is real and worth telling. As an established fact that Anne Boleyn or her family arranged the poisoning, it is unproven and almost certainly false. There is no solid evidence for it, and the speed with which such a convenient accusation attached itself to the king's controversial mistress should make us cautious, not credulous. The most likely truth is the plainest one, that a cook did something reckless or malicious with a powder, that 2 innocent people died for it, and that a frightened king used the moment to build a monstrous new law. So what became of that law, and of the punishment it invented? Its end came almost as suddenly as its beginning. When Henry VIII died, and his young son, Edward VI, came to the throne in 1547. One of the early acts of the new regime was a broad rolling back of the enormous tangle of new treasons and harsh penalties that Henry had piled up across his reign. The Treason Act of 1547 swept many of these away, and the boiling penalty went with them. A Henrician novelty born of one panic, dying in the general reaction against the excesses of the old king's later years. To grasp what was being undone, you have to see how far Henry had gone. Across his reign, he had multiplied the crimes that counted as treason, until the category, once narrowly reserved for those who made war on the king or plotted his death, had swollen to cover spoken words, private opinions, and the refusal of an oath. He had turned Parliament itself into a weapon of personal destruction, condemning by attainder where he might have had to persuade a jury. When the young Edward's councillors swept much of this away in 1547, they were not moved by any tenderness toward criminals. They were reacting against a machinery of state terror that had grown frightening even to the powerful men who operated it. A machinery in which any of them might one day find his own name written into an act of attainder. Boiling, the strange invention of a single poisoning panic, was carried out of English law on that same tide. It is worth understanding what that reaction was against, because it was not only against cruelty, it was against the constitutional strangeness of what had been done. A man had been condemned by name, by Act of Parliament, without a trial, for something he did before the law against it existed. To later lawyers and later ages, that retroactive, personal, juryless condemnation was as troubling as the pot itself, an example of the state bending its own legal order to reach a single, hated man. When people say that a country is governed by law and not by the will of one ruler, the boiling of Richard Roose is precisely the kind of thing they mean to rule out. The dead letter of the Act lingered on the books for centuries out of sheer neglect, and was only formally struck out in 1863. But as a living punishment, it lasted a single generation and was never mourned. On the continent, the story ran differently and lingered longer in scattered form, always tied to specific crimes rather than becoming general. The clearest thread runs through the punishment of counterfeiters, the men who forged and clipped and recast the coin of the realm. In the German and Hanseatic towns, forgers were boiled at Danzig, the city we now call Gdansk, as early as 1452, and at Stralsund on the Baltic coast in 1471. The choice of boiling for this particular crime carried a bitter poetry that the age would have understood at once. A counterfeiter committed his crime by melting metal and casting it into false money, and so the law melted him in turn, the punishment made into a mirror of the offence. Beyond the coiners, there were the exceptional murderers. A man was boiled in oil at Nuremberg in 1392 for the rape and murder of his own mother, and another was boiled in oil at Bremen as late as 1687 for helping counterfeiters escape justice, which tells you the method survived in isolated European use for a full 3 centuries after it appeared. And in the Dutch city of Deventer, a preserved execution cauldron still survives to this day, a heavy iron reminder in metal of what these towns once did to the men they judged most treacherous. Yet even taken all together, across all those centuries and cities, these remain a scattering of local, exceptional acts. Nowhere did boiling become the ordinary way a society killed its criminals. It remained what it had always been, a special horror held in reserve for the crimes a community found most treacherous: poisoning and the corruption of money, the secret betrayals of the body and of the coin. And I will be honest with you about the limits of the record, because that honesty is the point of this channel. We do not know the exact day Richard Roose died, whether the 5th of April in 1531 or a date a year later, since the sources disagree. We do not have his true intent, whether murderer or reckless fool. We do not have a reliable, single-sourced account of the crowd. What we do have, solid and beyond dispute, is the statute in its own harsh spelling, the 2 names of the dead at the bishop's gate, the chronicle of the chain and the gibbet, and the 16-year life of a law that a kingdom invented and then chose to unmake. Here is the thought I want to leave you with, quietly, because it is the real weight underneath all the smoke and the boiling water. The most frightening machine in this whole story was never the cauldron. Cauldrons are old, fire is old. What was new in 1531, what should genuinely unsettle us, is how quickly and how easily a state, when it was frightened, could sit down in its own halls of law and write a single human being a death that had never existed before, and close the door behind him and call it justice. The pot needed a fire and an afternoon. The law needed only fear and a pen, and a market crowd stood in a field to watch a cook die for it, and then went home, and the field went back to being a place where men sold cattle, and the water cooled, and Smithfield remembers none of it. But now you do. If this is the kind of history you want, careful with the legend and unafraid of the truth, subscribe and stay with us. Next time, we open the door on a device that England did not hide in a single panicked law, but used for centuries inside the quiet machinery of its courts. A machine of ropes and rollers built not to kill, but to make a man say anything at all.